The red and blue lights cut through the storm's darkness like knives, their harsh glow illuminating the faces pressed against the shelter's rain-streaked windows. Marcus Johnson felt his 8-year-old daughter Kira's small hand squeeze his fingers as two police officers stepped out of their patrol car, their heavy boots splashing through puddles that reflected the emergency vehicle's strobing lights. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" Kira whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that howled around the converted gymnasium that served as Pine Ridge's emergency hurricane shelter. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. The knot in his stomach had been growing tighter since the moment that woman, the one with the perfectly coiffed blonde hair and the designer rain jacket, had pointed at his family and made that phone call 20 minutes ago. Now, watching Officer Stevens and Officer Martinez approach the shelter's entrance, he felt the familiar weight of injustice settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "We're not in trouble, baby," he finally managed, though his voice cracked slightly. We're just staying dry until the storm passes." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus knew they weren't entirely true. Trouble had found them the moment they'd arrived at the shelter 6 hours earlier, soaked to the bone and desperate for safety as Hurricane Delilah bore down on their small coastal town. Trouble had blonde hair, manicured nails, and a sense of entitlement that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a furnace. The Johnson family had been living in their car for 3 weeks since Marcus lost his job at the shipyard. The plant closure had been sudden environmental regulations, the company claimed, though Marcus suspected it had more to do with moving operations to cheaper labor markets overseas. Sarah, his wife, had been working double shifts at the diner until last week, when she'd collapsed from exhaustion and stress-induced migraines that made it impossible for her to focus on the simplest tasks. When the evacuation order came through the emergency broadcast system, they'd driven straight to the shelter, hoping to find refuge from the storm that meteorologists were calling potentially catastrophic. The gymnasium at Pine Ridge Community Center had been transformed into a temporary haven rows of cots, folding tables laden with donated food, and volunteers bustling about with clipboards and concerned expressions. They'd been assigned cot number 47, near the back wall where the constant drip of a leaky roof created a steady percussion against a collection of mismatched buckets. Sarah had collapsed onto the thin mattress with visible relief, while Kira had immediately begun coloring in a book that one of the volunteers had given her, a simple act of childhood resilience that had brought tears to Marcus's eyes. For the first few hours, it had almost felt normal. Families of all backgrounds huddled together, sharing stories and supplies, united by the common threat of the storm raging outside. Children played quiet games in the corners, while adults checked their phones for updates on the hurricane's path. The smell of coffee and donated sandwiches mingled with the musty scent of the old building, creating an oddly comforting atmosphere of community solidarity. Then Karen Whitmore arrived. Marcus had noticed her immediately, not because she was particularly striking, but because she moved through the shelter with the confidence of someone who expected the world to rearrange itself around her convenience. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect bun despite the storm. Her expensive rain jacket was spotless, and she carried herself with the unmistakable air of someone who had never doubted her right to be anywhere she chose to be. She'd surveyed the shelter like a general inspecting troops, her pale blue eyes taking in every detail with obvious displeasure. When she'd approached the volunteer check-in table, her voice had carried across the space with crystalline clarity. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge," she'd announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "I'm Karen Whitmore, and I'm a taxpayer in this community. I want to know what screening process you're using for the people you're allowing in here." The volunteer, a tired-looking woman in her 60s named Betty, had looked up from her paperwork with confusion. "Ma'am, This is an emergency shelter. We're not screening anyone except to make sure they're seeking shelter from the storm." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Karen had replied, her voice growing sharper. "How do you know these people actually belong here? How do you know they're not just taking advantage of the situation?" Betty's expression had shifted from confusion to understanding, and Marcus had seen the exact moment when the volunteer realized what Karen was really asking. "Ma'am, everyone here is seeking shelter from Hurricane Delilah. That's the only requirement." But Karen hadn't been satisfied with that answer. She'd spent the next hour walking through the shelter, making pointed comments about people who don't look like they belong, and questioning volunteers about their procedures. Her eyes had lingered on Marcus and his family with particular intensity, and he'd felt the familiar burn of being judged, measured, and found wanting based on nothing more than the color of his skin. The breaking point had come when Kira had asked to use the bathroom. Marcus had walked her to the facilities at the far end of the gymnasium, passing by the area where Karen had stationed herself with her own family, a pale, nervous-looking husband, and 2 teenage children who seemed to shrink into themselves whenever their mother spoke. "Excuse me," Karen had called out as Marcus and Kira passed. "I don't think we've been properly introduced." Marcus had stopped, feeling every muscle in his body tense. "Marcus Johnson," he'd said simply. "This is my daughter Kira." "And you live here in Pine Ridge?" Karen had asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. "We've been here for 2 years," Marcus had replied, not seeing the need to explain their current housing situation to a stranger. "Interesting," Karen had said, her smile sharp as a blade. "Because I know most of the families in this area, and I don't remember seeing you at any of our community events. The homeowners association meetings, the school board gatherings, the annual fundraisers." The implication had been clear, and Marcus had felt his hands clench into fists. "We rent on the other side of town," he'd said carefully. "And we've been dealing with some financial difficulties lately." "I see." Karen had nodded, her expression suggesting she'd just confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Well, I hope you find somewhere more suitable to stay once the storm passes." The conversation had ended there, but Marcus had known it wasn't over. He'd seen the way Karen's eyes had followed his family as they'd returned to their cot. The way she'd whispered to her husband while glancing in their direction. The way she'd pulled out her phone and begun typing with obvious agitation. 20 minutes later, the police had arrived. Now, as Officer Stevens pushed through the shelter's main entrance, his rain-soaked uniform gleaming under the fluorescent lights, Marcus felt the eyes of every person in the building turn toward him. The comfortable buzz of conversation that had filled the space fell silent, replaced by the sound of rain against windows and the distant rumble of thunder. "I'm looking for the Johnson family," Officer Stevens announced, his voice carrying easily across the space. He was a tall man with graying hair and tired eyes, the kind of cop who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything, but was still capable of being disappointed by human nature. Marcus stood slowly, his hand still clasped around Kira's. "That's us," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Officer Stevens approached, his partner Martinez flanking him. The younger officer's hand rested casually on his duty belt, not threatening, but ready. "Sir, we received a call about a possible trespassing situation. Someone reported that you and your family don't have authorization to be in this shelter." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Around them, he could hear the sharp intake of breath from other shelter residents, the rustle of fabric as people shifted uncomfortably on their cots. "Trespassing," he repeated, incredulous. This is a public emergency shelter. We're here because of the hurricane, just like everyone else. I understand that, sir. Officer Stevens replied, his tone suggesting he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation either. But we need to verify that you're eligible to be here. Do you have identification and proof of local residency? Marcus felt his stomach drop. They'd been evicted from their apartment 3 weeks ago, and while he had identification, he didn't have any utility bills or lease agreements to prove they currently lived in Pine Ridge. Officer, we were residents until recently. We're going through a difficult time financially, but we're not trespassing. This is an emergency shelter for hurricane victims. Sir, I'm going to need you to step outside with me so we can discuss this privately, Officer Stevens said, glancing around at the growing crowd of onlookers. It was then that Sarah, who had been lying on the cot trying to manage her migraine, struggled to her feet. Her face was pale, her movements unsteady, but her voice was clear when she spoke. Officers, we have every right to be here. We're American citizens. We're residents of this county, and we're seeking shelter from a hurricane. What more do you need to know? Officer Martinez stepped forward, his younger face lacking the patience of his partner. Ma'am, we're trying to handle this quietly. If you'll just cooperate. Cooperate with what? Sarah's voice rose, drawing even more attention. With being thrown out into a hurricane because someone doesn't think we belong here. The tension in the room was palpable now. Marcus could see other families watching, some with sympathy, others with the uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing something that shouldn't be happening, but wasn't surprising either. He noticed an elderly black man shake his head sadly, a young Latina woman pull her children closer, a white couple exchange worried glances. Karen Whitmore chose that moment to insert herself into the situation. She approached the group with the confidence of someone who believed she was solving a problem rather than creating one. Officers, I'm so glad you're here. I'm the one who called. I just want to make sure that people who are genuinely in need get the help they deserve, and that resources aren't being wasted on people who are just taking advantage of the situation. Officer Stevens turned to her, his expression unreadable. Ma'am, what specific information do you have about this family? Well, I've never seen them at any community events, Karen replied, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something obvious. They claim to live here, but I know most of the homeowners in this area, and I've never seen them before. And look at them. She gestured toward the family. They're obviously homeless. They're taking up space that should go to real residents who pay taxes and contribute to this community. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Marcus felt his face burn with shame and anger, not for his circumstances, but for the way this woman was describing his family in front of his daughter. Kira pressed closer to his side, and he could feel her trembling. Ma'am, Officer Stevens said carefully, being homeless doesn't disqualify someone from using an emergency shelter during a hurricane. These facilities are for anyone seeking refuge from the storm. But Karen wasn't backing down. Officer, I pay taxes in this community. I volunteer for local charities. I know the difference between people who belong here and people who are just here. And I'm telling you, these people don't belong. The conversation might have continued in that vein, with Marcus and his family caught in the middle of an increasingly uncomfortable situation. But at that moment, the shelter's main door burst open again. This time, it wasn't police officers who entered, it was a news crew. Channel 7's storm coverage team had arrived to do a human interest story about the shelter, and they'd walked directly into the middle of the confrontation. The bright lights of the camera illuminated the scene like a stage, and Marcus realized with growing horror that his family's humiliation was about to be broadcast to the entire region. "This is Rebecca Chen with Channel 7 News," the reporter announced, apparently oblivious to the tension in the room. "We're here at the Pine Ridge Community Center, where dozens of families are riding out Hurricane Delilah. We're told there's been some kind of incident here tonight." The camera panned across the shelter, taking in the rows of cots, the worried faces of the residents, and the cluster of people gathered around the Johnson family. Marcus tried to step back, to shield Kira from the camera's unforgiving eye, but Officer Martinez moved to block their path. "Sir, I'm going to need you to remain where you are until we sort this out," the officer said, his hand moving to his radio. That's when everything went wrong. The news crew, sensing a story, moved closer with their camera. Karen, apparently energized by the presence of media, began speaking louder and more emphatically about her concerns. Other shelter residents started to murmur and shift, some defending the Johnson family, others clearly uncomfortable with the growing circus atmosphere. And then, Officer Martinez, perhaps feeling the pressure of the cameras and the crowd, made a decision that would haunt him for months to come. He grabbed Marcus by the arm and began leading him toward the exit. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent shelter. "No," Kira screamed, the sound cutting through the air like a siren. "Don't take my daddy." Sarah lunged forward, trying to reach her husband, but Officer Stevens caught her arm. "Ma'am, please step back." The camera captured it, all the little girl's tears, the mother's desperate struggle, the father's dignity as he was led away in handcuffs that appeared as if from nowhere. The bright lights made everything look harsh and unforgiving, turning what should have been a place of refuge into a scene of injustice. "This is outrageous!" someone shouted from the crowd. Marcus couldn't see who it was, but the voice was strong and female, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. The news crew swung their camera toward the voice, and Marcus saw a woman in her 50s pushing through the crowd. She was tall and commanding, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, but she moved with the confidence of someone who wielded real power. "Councilwoman Rodriguez," Rebecca Chen said, recognition dawning in her voice. "Were you aware of this situation?" Elena Rodriguez, Pine Ridge's first Latina city council member and a former civil rights attorney, surveyed the scene with obvious disgust. "I was not aware, but I am now. Officers, on what grounds are you removing this family from a public emergency shelter?" Officer Stevens looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we received a complaint about possible trespassing. We're just trying to verify their eligibility to be here." Eligibility. Councilwoman Rodriguez's voice rose with indignation. The eligibility for an emergency shelter during a hurricane is being human and needing shelter. That's it. She turned to Karen, who was still standing near the group with a self-satisfied expression. Are you the one who called the police?" Karen straightened, apparently believing she was about to be commended for her civic duty. "Yes, I did. I'm Karen Whitmore, and I'm a homeowner in this community. I pay taxes, and I have every right to make sure that public resources are being used appropriately." "And what exactly did you tell the police that made them think this family was trespassing?" Councilwoman Rodriguez asked, her voice dangerously calm. "I told them the truth," Karen replied, her chin lifting defiantly. "These people don't belong here. They're not homeowners. They're not contributing members of this community. And they're taking up space that should go to real residents." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Councilwoman Rodriguez walked slowly toward Karen, her eyes never leaving the woman's face. "Real residents," she repeated slowly. "And what, in your opinion, makes a resident real?" Karen faltered slightly, perhaps sensing that the conversation wasn't going the way she'd expected. "Well, I mean, people who own property, who pay taxes, who contribute to the community." "People who look like you mean?" Councilwoman Rodriguez said, her voice cutting through Karen's words like a blade. The accusation hung in the air, and Karen's face flushed red. "That's not what I said. This isn't about race." "Isn't it?" Councilwoman Rodriguez turned to address the news camera directly. "Let me tell you what's happening here. A family seeking shelter from a hurricane. A black family has been harassed, humiliated, and nearly arrested because one woman decided they didn't look like they belonged. This is 2024, and we're still dealing with this." She walked over to where Marcus stood, still in handcuffs, and addressed Officer Stevens directly. "Officer, I want you to release this man immediately. He has committed no crime, and there are no grounds for his detention." Officer Stevens looked between the councilwoman, the news camera, and his partner, clearly calculating the political implications of his next move. After a long moment, he nodded to Officer Martinez, who reluctantly removed the handcuffs. Marcus rubbed his wrists, trying to restore circulation, but his attention was focused on Councilwoman Rodriguez. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "We're not done here." She turned back to Karen, who was now looking decidedly less confident. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to understand something very clearly. This family has every right to be in this shelter. They are residents of this county. They are seeking refuge from a natural disaster, and they are under the protection of both state and federal emergency management laws." Karen's husband, who had been silent throughout the entire ordeal, finally spoke up. "Karen, maybe we should just—" "No!" Karen snapped, her composure finally cracking. "I'm not going to be lectured by— She gestured wildly at Councilwoman Rodriguez. "By what?" the councilwoman asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Around them, the shelter had gone completely silent, except for the sound of rain and the low hum of the news camera. It was at that moment that Betty, the volunteer who had been working the check-in table, approached the group with a folder in her hands. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I think there's something everyone should know." She opened the folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. "I've been working with the county's emergency management office for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this. But after Mrs. Whitmore's concerns, I decided to do some research." She looked directly at Karen. "Did you know that the Johnson family has been on our county's emergency contact list for 2 years? Marcus Johnson is a registered volunteer with the Red Cross Disaster Relief Team. He's helped coordinate 3 hurricane responses, 2 flood rescues, and a tornado cleanup. He's probably done more for this community's emergency preparedness than most people in this room." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Marcus felt his face burn with embarrassment, not because he was ashamed of his volunteer work, but because he hated having his private contributions aired in public. He'd never volunteered for recognition. He'd done it because he knew what it felt like to need help. Betty wasn't finished. "And Sarah Johnson. She's been working double shifts at Murphy's Diner for the past year. serving the breakfast crowd that includes half the city council, 3 school board members, and most of the local business owners. She's probably fed more real residents in the past month than anyone else in this room. The weight of the information settled over the shelter like a heavy blanket. Marcus could see people looking at him and his family with new eyes, some with shame, others with recognition. The elderly black man who had shaken his head earlier now smiled and nodded approvingly. Karen, however, was not willing to concede defeat. That's not the point," she stammered. "The point is that they're homeless. They're taking up resources that should go to families who actually have something to lose." The words were so callous, so completely lacking in empathy, that several people in the crowd actually gasped. Marcus felt Sarah tense beside him, and he reached out to take her hand. But it was Kira who responded first. The 8-year-old stepped forward, her small voice carrying clearly across the silent shelter. "We lost our home because Daddy's job went away, but we didn't lose our family. We didn't lose our love. And we didn't lose our right to be safe from the storm." The child's words, spoken with the simple clarity that only children possess, seemed to break something in the room. Several people began to applaud, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. The sound filled the space, drowning out the storm outside and the uncomfortable silence that had dominated the evening. Karen looked around desperately, as if searching for support, but found only disapproving faces. Her husband placed a hand on her arm, his expression pleading. "Karen, please, let's just go." But Councilwoman Rodriguez wasn't finished. "Mrs. Whitmore, you've made some very serious accusations tonight. You've harassed a family, wasted police resources, and attempted to use your perceived social status to deny basic human rights to fellow citizens. I want you to know that I will be filing a complaint with the city attorney's office first thing Monday morning." Karen's face went white. "You can't do that. I was just trying to protect the community." "Protect it from what?" Councilwoman Rodriguez asked. "From a working family going through a difficult time. From people who have contributed more to this community than you apparently know. From a little girl who just wants to be safe from the storm." The questions hung in the air unanswered. Karen looked around the room one more time, seemed to realize that she had no allies left, and began gathering her things with sharp, angry movements. "This isn't over," she said, her voice tight with rage. "I know people in this town. I have influence. This isn't over." As she and her family made their way toward the exit, dragging their expensive luggage behind them, Councilwoman Rodriguez called out one final time. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're absolutely right. This isn't over, because I'm going to make sure that what happened here tonight never happens again." The door slammed behind the Whitmore family, leaving them to face the storm outside a storm that suddenly seemed less threatening than the atmosphere they'd created in the shelter. In the silence that followed, Marcus found himself surrounded by people he'd never met, but who seemed to understand exactly what he'd experienced. The elderly black man introduced himself as James Washington, a retired teacher who had lived through the civil rights movement. The young Latina woman was Maria Santos, a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her children. The white couple who had exchanged worried glances turned out to be retired social workers who had spent their careers fighting for families like the Johnsons. But it was Rebecca Chen, the news reporter, who asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Councilwoman Rodriguez, what exactly will you be doing to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Elena Rodriguez looked directly into the camera, her expression determined. "I'm calling for an emergency city council meeting for tomorrow afternoon. We're going to draft and pass an ordinance that explicitly prohibits discrimination in any public emergency facility. We're going to establish clear procedures for emergency shelter access that can't be manipulated by personal bias. And we're going to make sure that every city employee and volunteer understands that equal access to public safety services is not negotiable. She turned to Marcus and his family. And I'm going to make sure that the Johnson family gets the support they need to get back on their feet. Because that's what communities do. We take care of each other. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of activity. Hurricane Delilah made landfall with devastating force, but the shelter held strong. The Johnson family rode out the storm surrounded by new friends and allies, sharing meals and stories with people who had seen them at their most vulnerable and chose to offer dignity rather than judgment. When the storm finally passed and the sun emerged from behind the clouds, the Johnson family walked out of the shelter to find that their world had changed. News of the incident had spread far beyond Channel 7's initial report. Social media had picked up the story, and by Monday morning, it was being discussed on national news programs. The emergency city council meeting that Councilwoman Rodriguez had promised was packed beyond capacity. The Johnson family sat in the front row, still overwhelmed by the attention, but determined to see the process through. Marcus had spent the weekend thinking about what he wanted to say, and when his time came to speak, his words were measured and powerful. "I don't want anyone to go through what my family experienced," he told the council. Not because it was painful, though it was, but because it revealed something ugly about our community that we need to address. No family should have to prove their worth to receive basic human compassion. The council voted unanimously to pass the Emergency Shelter Access Protection Ordinance. But the real victory came when several local business owners approached Marcus after the meeting. By the end of the week, he had 3 job offers, and Sarah had been connected with a healthcare program that would help manage her migraines. The most significant development came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a wealthy widow who had followed the story in the news, contacted the family through Councilwoman Rodriguez's office. She owned several rental properties in town and had been looking for responsible tenants to help her manage them. "I don't want charity," Marcus had told her during their first meeting. "I want to earn what we get." "Good," Dr. Hendricks had replied. "Because I'm not offering charity. I'm offering opportunity. You manage 3 of my properties, handle the maintenance and tenant relations, and your family gets free housing plus a salary. Think of it as a property management position that comes with benefits." It was exactly the kind of arrangement that Marcus had been hoping for, a chance to use his skills and work ethic to build something stable for his family. Karen Whitmore, meanwhile, found herself facing consequences that she had never anticipated. The city attorney's office did indeed file a complaint, citing harassment and abuse of emergency services. While the legal penalties were relatively minor community service and a small fine, the social consequences were severe. Her homeowners association voted to remove her from her position as president. The charity organizations she had volunteered with quietly asked her to step down. Her husband's business began losing clients as word spread about the incident. Their teenage children, mortified by their mother's behavior, began spending more time with friends and less time at home. The breaking point came when Karen showed up at the Johnson family's new home, a modest but comfortable house that Dr. Hendricks had provided, apparently intent on continuing her harassment. Marcus opened the door to find her standing on his porch, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. "You think you've won," she said without preamble. "You think you've destroyed my life, but you haven't. I'm not going to let you get away with this." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. seeing not a powerful adversary, but a woman who had lost everything through her own choices. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I never wanted to destroy your life. I just wanted to live mine." The simplicity of the statement seemed to deflate her rage. For a moment, she looked genuinely confused, as if she couldn't understand how someone could fail to reciprocate her hatred. "You've cost me everything," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "No," Marcus replied gently. "You cost yourself everything. I was just trying to keep my family safe from a storm." Karen stared at him for another long moment, then turned and walked away. She moved to another town 6 months later, and Marcus never saw her again. But the story didn't end there. The Johnson family's experience had sparked a broader conversation about discrimination, community responsibility, and the meaning of belonging. Councilwoman Rodriguez used the momentum from the emergency shelter incident to push through several other progressive policies, including expanded affordable housing programs and improved support services for families in crisis. Marcus found himself reluctantly thrust into a leadership role, speaking at community events and working with local organizations to address systemic inequities. He discovered that his experience, while painful, had given him a unique perspective and a platform to advocate for change. Sarah's health improved dramatically once the family's housing situation stabilized. The constant stress of homelessness had exacerbated her migraines, and with proper medical care and a stable living situation, she was able to return to work. She eventually opened her own small catering business, building on the reputation she'd established at Murphy's Diner. Kira, despite her young age, seemed to understand the significance of what had happened. She began writing stories about fairness and kindness, sharing them with her classmates and teachers. Her simple wisdom that losing possessions didn't mean losing what truly mattered became a guiding principle for the family's new life. 1 year later, Marcus stood before the Pine Ridge Community Center, now renamed the Elena Rodriguez Community Center, in honor of the councilwoman who had stood up for justice. The building had been renovated and expanded, with new facilities for emergency services and community programs. The annual Hurricane Preparedness Day had become one of the town's most important events, bringing together residents of all backgrounds to train for emergency response and celebrate the community's resilience. Marcus served as one of the volunteer coordinators, helping to ensure that the mistakes of the previous year would never be repeated. As he watched families of all colors and backgrounds working together to prepare for the hurricane season, Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had turned a moment of injustice into an opportunity for growth, a crisis into a catalyst for positive change. That evening, as the Johnson family sat around the dinner table in their comfortable home, Kira asked the question that had been on her mind all day. "Daddy, do you think that lady learned anything from what happened?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I don't know, sweetheart. Sometimes people need to lose things before they can learn what really matters. But I do know that we learned something important." "What's that?" "That when storms come, whether they're made of wind and rain or fear and hatred, the best thing we can do is stand together and help each other weather them. Because that's what makes us a real community." Outside, the evening sky was clear and calm, with no storms on the horizon. But inside the Johnson home, and in homes throughout Pine Ridge, families were stronger and more united than they had been before the storm. They had learned that true shelter wasn't just about having a roof over your head. It was about having a community that would stand with you when the winds began to blow. The Johnson family story had become part of Pine Ridge's history, A reminder that justice and compassion could prevail even in the darkest storms. And in a world that often seemed divided by fear and suspicion, that was a message worth sharing, a lesson worth remembering, and a hope worth holding on to. As Marcus tucked Kira into bed that night, she asked one final question. "Daddy, if another storm comes, will we be ready?" Marcus smiled, thinking of the community they had helped build, the friends they had made, and the changes they had inspired. "Yes, baby," he said, turning off the light. "We'll be ready." And in the darkness of the comfortable room, surrounded by the warmth of home and the security of belonging, the Johnson family slept peacefully, knowing that they had weathered the worst storm of all, the storm of hatred and prejudice, and emerged stronger on the other side. The story of that night in the emergency shelter would be told and retold for years to come, becoming part of the community's collective memory. It would serve as a reminder that change was possible, that justice could prevail, and that even in the darkest moments, there were people willing to stand up and do what was right. But perhaps most importantly, it would remind everyone who heard it that home wasn't just a place, it was a feeling, a sense of belonging, and a community that would shelter you from whatever storms might come.